Let's talk about organic corn, conventional corn. Our recommendation is to pair the biocontrol nematodes with a BT trait, even if the trait's failing. But can you talk through why we need to pair our nematodes with a BT trait and why we have to say no to all those organic farmers?
Well, you've actually asked two questions. We had, first of all, organic or conventionally produced corn without a BT trait. So let's take the second first. We have the problem of rootworm resistance because we have gone after rootworm management with a single mortality. The single mortality is maybe rotation. The insect adapts to laying its eggs in soybeans. We go after it with a single soil insecticide. It adapts by becoming resistant to the insecticide. We go at it with a single BT trait. It adapts. So why wouldn't it adapt if all we used was biocontrol nematodes? There's a long worn path of resistance by this insect to single mortality strategies. So we have decided as a viable way to preserve this tool to only use it in fields where we have a second mortality factor. So if we used it in conventionally grown corn, it would be a single mortality factor. If we're using it with a trait, the trait, even though it's failing, kills a lot of larvae, and the nematodes kill the survivors of the toxin. Now, why not organic? Well, organic's the same way. In other words, it would be a single mortality factor. The other issue that we have found through research is the neonic seed treatment on conventional corn or traded corn actually helps the efficacy of the nematodes and they become more efficacious. And apparently, the neonic interferes, the neonicotinoid on the seed interferes with the immune response. Even though it doesn't kill the insect, it interferes with the immune response, and so the nematode can come in and more effectively kill the rootworm larvae. So organic, you do not have the assistance of the seed treatment, or do you have the assistance of any other mortality factor? So that's why
And so it becomes we're worried about resistance development.
we're worried about resistance development. And my comment is like, haven't we learned anything in the past 50 years? Why should we, when we have a new independent mortality factor, why shouldn't we learn from the history of past failures?
I know a lot of farmers are using layering soil insecticide on with their failing BT traits. Can you talk about what's happening below ground when they do that and what the results are?
Okay, so a lot of times we layer soil insecticide over a failing BT trait and think we're controlling a rootworm. The insecticide is applied in a very narrow band over the row. Rootworm occurs from the base of the plant all the way out into the middle of the row. So the insecticide only gives us standability at harvest. That's all it does. Farmers are fooled into thinking that they're suppressing rootworm, but research in the 70s showed that an insecticide-treated acre produces more rootworm than an untreated acre. Now, why is that? Well, because you're protecting the base of the plant. You're not allowing the rootworm to chew off the base of the plant, and so you're preserving the food source, the roots, for all the rootworms out in the middle of the row. And so you actually get more adults emerging when you use a soil insecticide. But you get standability. And half the problem with rootworm damage is you have to slow down for harvest. That's lost money. You don't get everything. There are cobs on the ground. There's harvest loss is increased when you have rootworm damage. So that's in addition to yield loss from the damage. Oh, the first thing about RNAi, the new toxin, is to understand the difference between mortality between the older BTs and the new RNAi toxins. The older BTs traits, when they were effective, when the insect took a bite, they quit feeding immediately and they died a week later. So therefore, you just got light scarring on the root and it really wasn't economic feeding. As we developed resistance to BT, we saw a greater and greater level of root feeding before the insect maybe died or what have you. So therefore, light feeding didn't cause us problems. RNAi, the insect takes a bite, and while they may have ingested a toxic dose, it kills so slowly that they continue feeding for a week before they die. And so if the larvae is a little larger or you have a heavy population, you actually get 1.5 nodes of damage to your roots from these uh, rootworm larvae that actually have eaten a toxic dose, but it takes them a week to die. Now, if you layer biocontrol nematodes over RNAi, what you have is the nematodes come in and actually kill the larvae before the RNAi kills the larvae, and therefore we see no damage. We don't see the typical RNAi type damage. Now, the philosophy between RNAi is that, well, you'll suffer damage the first year, but you so deplete the population that in year 2, you won't see as much of this pre-death feeding. Well, if you think about Iowa, the fields are so close together, your neighbor may not use it, and your neighbor's very happy to give you all of his rootworms. So it's not a valid philosophy logic in the Midwest. You get out in the West where you have a center pivot surrounded by desert, then that's your own population, and that strategy may in fact work. But that's RNAi. The second issue with RNAi is Monsanto published a paper that showed that in the laboratory, RNAi developed rootworm developed resistance to RNAi within 2 generations. What they did is they took an early RNAi out to the field in Illinois. They tended a 40-acre field. They collected all the survivors, took them to the laboratory, and then proceeded to show that in 2 generations they were resistant. So how does this compare to our failing trait, BT trait? So under the similar conditions, it took 3 to 7 years with BT. And so RNAi is not expected to be as durable or have the longevity of BT. And in some of the early fields, we're already seeing damage in the second year of deployment out in the field.
And can you talk about cross resistance? Will farmers be able to switch between like they did with the BTs?
Well, this 2018 paper also reported that the resistance to RNAi is a cross resistance to all other RNAis. So the answer is probably no. The other thing is the 2 companies that are marketing RNAi, Vorseed and SmartStack Pro, it's the same identical toxin. So rootworm traits and biocontrol nematodes are completely compatible. They are 2 different independent mortality factors working on rootworm, and they extend the usefulness and durability of all the rootworm traits. So if you have a failing trait, we can, SmartStack or Herculex or Duracade or something like that that's failing. It is still killing a lot of rootworm. It's just not killing enough to prevent root damage. So if we actually then layer over a single application of biocontrol nematodes, the biocontrol nematodes are killing the resistant survivors to the trait, and they're working together.